Hey there, my name is Jeff Fritz, and thanks for joining me here at .NET Conf. I'm going to take about an hour here and talk about modernizing your ASP.NET Web Forms applications with Visual Studio 2015. We've introduced a lot of features to Web Forms, and I want to make sure that you're aware of what's going on, because we're seeing that a number of features aren't used a lot when we talk to customers, and I want to get you up to speed, let you take advantage of some of these great features that we have that'll make your development easier. My name is Jeff Fritz. I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET Web Forms team. So it's been a while. We've been doing Web Forms now for about 16 years. Gosh, it's been a long time. And what makes it so great? Well, we've got ease of use with a great designer surface if you like to work that way. If you like to drag and drop controls on a designer surface, right? We use controls. We don't have to worry about learning HTML and JavaScript and CSS. When we've got that all bundled up into a nice little control, we can drop where we need it. Stateful web pages. I don't need to think about what state my page is in. It's just there in the state that I left it. And event-managed interactions. If I'm a Windows Forms developer or a WPF developer, I'm used to working with events, and I can continue to use that in Web Forms, right? Easy stuff that we're familiar with and able to use. We've got rendered markup on the server. Our servers take a lot of that work of making sure that the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS is put together properly before it gets served to our customers. And of course, we've got that flexible server-side model. All we're doing is generating angle brackets and curly braces. I can do other things out there as well and generate images and send those down to my visitors. But I can add on other features to my Web Forms projects as well. We'll take a look at that. And of course, we've got to focus on .NET code, and I can stay out of CSS and JavaScript maintenance when I build Web Forms applications if I don't want to. But as we're going to see, in today's web, that's something that you're going to want to consider. So seriously, what's new with Web Forms? We've seen all these other frameworks come up, MVC and Web API. Why do I want to still consider Web Forms? Well, we introduced Async Model Binding. So asynchronously, you can bind controls to models on the server. This is a really powerful technology that enables you to disconnect the processing from the request and then take on more load on your server. Roslyn support. We've kept up to date with all the latest compilers, so you can use those latest features of C# and Visual Basic in your ASPX pages to deliver a better experience and to make your development easier. HTTP 2. So this is kind of a new thing where folks are starting to get into using the new version of HTTP to be able to deliver more content faster, with a guaranteed SSL connection and multiplexing capabilities coming from the web server. It's going to make your visitors be aware that they get a more secure and faster to access website. We've introduced the Task Runner Explorer inside of Visual Studio. You can integrate those actions on the Task Runner Explorer with your Web Forms project. In this way, if you build and use those node tools from the Task Runner Explorer, you'll be able to trigger events from your Web Forms project and allow those node tools to take effect to go and automate processes for you. And that's a pretty cool thing. And we're adding more async improvements to the ASP.NET providers in our upcoming release. So how can we improve our applications? What are some concrete things that we can consider to improve our Web Forms applications? Well, we can start by minimizing server operations for an initial user interface. This means that we're not doing so much work to calculate and grab data or check security. If we can minimize those interactions and deliver an initial set of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, we'll end up with a faster experience and be able to scale our server more as well. Let's compose and render data in the browser, not on the server. So following along with that first bullet point, if we can put together our data and insert it into the user interface With browser technology instead of the server technology, now we're taking advantage of all those processors on people whose browsers are coming to my website instead of having to make my web server build and pull those components together for me. So you get to scale by using other people's processors instead of yours. Let's streamline those interactions with the server. Let's minimize the number of round trips that we make. We don't need to keep coming back again and again and again for additional JavaScript files or CSS files when we can concatenate those together, compress them, minify them, and deliver them to our visitors in a concise manner so they don't have to go and grab 12, 15 different script files just to render your one web page. And then we can start taking advantage of browser cache. Some of you are probably already using output cache settings and other features to be able to push features down into the browser so that they're not making requests back to your server. But we can do other things as well with modern JavaScript and HTML5 that will allow that content to be saved locally to the browser in data stores local to that browser, and then use JavaScript to fetch and work with the data there. JavaScript for the win, right? This is a big topic with web development these days, is using modern JavaScript techniques. The ECMAScript 2015 standard gives you a lot of great features that you should start exploring and adding into your web forms capabilities. Nothing says you have to stick strictly with C# or Visual Basic when you build ASP.NET Web Forms. Start adding on and building new things with JavaScript. Enhance your application and use some of these modern frameworks like Angular or React or Knockout, and you can deliver a really great experience. And then let's use some responsive techniques inside of our application so that those folks who are using mobile browsers will get a better experience when they visit my application. Nobody likes when they visit a website with their phone and they have to scroll around or resize or shrink and grow it just so they can see what's going on. Let's use some tools, let's use some responsive frameworks so that we can make it fit every time. So that's enough for the slides. I want to get over to the demos. I want to take that ASP.NET 2 application that I know some of you out there that are watching, you've got that ASP.NET 2 application that's been hanging around for 10 years, and you want to bring it up and start using some cool new features, some Ajax, some JavaScript to make great things happen. So I'm going to roll over to Visual Studio, and we're going to take a look at really a simple application that I built a long time ago, and I'm just going to start up and show you. It's a grid that shows me, here's a list of the trips that I have coming up that other people in my organization might want to know about. So this is going to load up, and we're going to see a simple grid with there's a list of trips that I can go and work with. And you know what? This took me all of 5-10 minutes to put together. A few years ago, it was real easy for me to work with when I built it back then. And I'm going to go through and show you this series of demos where we're going to modernize this and take it from this cheesy little grid to something that's a little bit more dynamic, works better with my phone, and uses some modern JavaScript techniques to work with ASP.NET Web Forms. So the way that this page started out, I had a SQL data source that I placed on the screen, and I selected some data from my trips table inside of my trips connection string, and I don't know about you guys, but looking back at this code here in 2016 and seeing SQL embedded in my ASPX page, it gives me the heebie-jeebies, right? This is a terrible practice. If you're going to use this page for more than one or two things, or you're going to start to reuse some of this logic, this is database logic embedded in my application, in my HTML. There's a separation of concerns that I want to happen here so that if that trips table changes, I can modify it in one place and it affects everywhere that I use it. This is not a great practice. And I've got a grid view here that I wired up by just pointing over to it when I used my helper tag here. And I was able to use that SQL data source to configure some paging and sorting on that grid. And yeah, it's pretty standard ASPX. but nothing really exciting here yet. Let me go over to really some steps that I want to do to make this feel a little bit more like something that was built in the last 2 or 3 years. So the second demo I have here, conveniently in a folder named 2, I started using a master page, and I wanted to put my styles here at the top so that I had CSS styles that I could reuse throughout the page and take advantage of not having to write the same formatting again and again, or using the server-side interactions and some of those attributes to format my controls. So scrolling down, you see I just have a place for my title. I've got a little footer here. I'm using the HTML5 footer tag. Visual Studio knows about the HTML5 tags. You can use those and it'll detect and help with auto-completion and other features that you may want to do in HTML5. Input tags, it knows the various text modes and will help complete and give you hints as to the various capabilities that you can add on. So a content placeholder, but really the work is coming here in my default page. And I've got another grid, and I've specified data key names for the values that are coming back. There's bound columns, and I want to put a template column here at the end that shows the number of days that each one of these trips takes. And I've got this ugly bind syntax here, and this is a real pain in the neck to use. But I have a rich trip model object that I can use with something that we introduced called strongly typed data binding here. So if I specify an item type and I press equals on this control, I now get a list of all the model objects that I can grab and say, this grid is representing this data point. So I'm going to represent my trip object with this grid. And what that gives me then is, instead of data binding with a bind method, I can actually refer to the item directly, and I've got all the IntelliSense features of my trip object right here on this item. So I don't have to do this date time parse anymore, because I actually have a date object under this toDateTime field. So let's say item toDateTime, and I don't need to do this datetime parse either. Let's get rid of that. So I can get rid of this and say item.fromDateTime. So now I've calculated a duration, the total days. Let's format that as a string. Now, I mentioned model binding as one of the features that we added. Let me show you how we can start adding model binding to this grid and how Visual Studio will help you to make that data acquisition story a little bit easier. Model binding helps us to put those data acquisition and interaction methods into the code behind of my ASPX page, or else we'll see in a little bit any other class that we want to work with. So we have a series of 4 methods that are made available to us, called select method is the first one that we're going to look at. And as I type this, I'm going to get IntelliSense that's going to help me build out the appropriate method signature that I need. And I'm not getting my IntelliSense, of course, because this is live. There we go. So I can say create new method. I already have a method created called gridGetData. Just so you can see what happens, I'm going to choose to create new method, and it's going to name it gridGetData1. It's very creative when it names these. It's working on my grid object and it's getting data, so gridGetData. And when I look at the code behind for this, it creates gridGetData1, and it gives me a little bit of commenting here to indicate here's some other things you may want to do with this method, some other parameters you may want to accept so that you can interact and provide a little bit more value to your control. Now, as you saw, I've already got another method written here. So let me just go up here. I have gridGetData, and it returns an iQueryable of type models.trip. So by returning an iQueryable, what this will allow ASP.NET to do is perform all the paging and sorting operations through the iQueryable, instead of me having to calculate and do that by hand, as it's indicating with these method parameters it's suggesting. So let me come back to my default page, not this one, to the one I was working on. And I'm going to turn this back to get data. Now with that saved, I can start this, and we'll see how my second demo here looks pretty similar, but is now delivering things in the code behind with a repository method that I can reuse. And I've got things out of my ASPX, out of where I'm formatting data, and now where I'm actually working with and crafting data. I have a repository object, and I'm just calling get, and it presents the same data. I've added some formatting here, and I have some sorting capabilities as well. So very quickly and easily, by adding a select method, I'm able to move my data fetch logic into the code behind. And with only a couple lines of code, I can now retrieve and work with that data very easily. So that's nice, but what if I wanted to actually put things in my repository and leave it over there and keep my data interaction methods out of my ASPX page and my code behind? Because when I'm in the code behind, I really don't want to work with data there. I've got somewhere else to work with the data. Let's keep it out of our web formatting code. So what you can do, and this is something that takes a little bit of digging to find, and you can work with something called the calling data methods. There it is, calling data methods. This is an event that will be called right before one of those model binding events happens, and we can reach in and change where those methods are located. So once again, I can create the new event and point to it, but I do have the method sitting here, grid calling data methods. Now, what's interesting about this one is I'm actually passing in an instantiated object. I've already created my repository up here at the top of my page, and I'm passing it in as my data methods object to the event handler, my calling data methods events. And there it's going to learn and figure out, okay, the select method is actually over here on this repository object, and it will call that instead. So where I want to make this use grid calling data methods, now it's not grid get data, it's just get, because that's the name of the method on my repository that I want ASP.NET to call. So if we go and run that again, it's going to reroute and call over there directly, and I should get the exact same results. So let's refresh. And there we go. I got the same results, and now I don't have my data management methods and techniques sitting in my ASPX or my ASPX CS. So pretty good movement for me to isolate and keep things in one place. Something I'd like to point out though, if you take a look at my address bar here, I'm navigating to just /2, even though this is /2 default ASPX. Now, what's going on here is something with ASP.NET routing, which our friends who use the MVC frameworks are very familiar with. You can add routing into ASP.NET Web Forms because routing is an ASP.NET concern, not an MVC concern. Now, by lighting up a feature called friendly URLs, I get the ability to drop those ASPX extensions. I can still navigate to default ASPX, and I'll get the same page, but I can, as a more friendly URL, drop and just go straight to /2 because it's the default ASPX page. It's the default page inside that folder that it's navigating to. So not bad. I can use a little bit more friendly URL that is a little bit more search engine real, right? Search engines don't like to see default ASPX with question marks and ampersands and hashes hanging off at the end of it. This is something that I can even tell my mother to navigate to. Hey, Mom, navigate to this website /2, and she can find that easily. Don't have to worry about all these markup you have to stick at the end of it, or engaging a bit.ly type URL shortener just so you can pass along a URL. So that's friendly URLs. Friendly URLs is enabled in our startup, configuration here, I'm looking in the wrong place. Where's app start? I don't see friendly URLs. It's enabled somewhere else. It's very easy to add on with a routes.enable friendly URLs method to your existing projects. Let me move on to the next set of demos that I want to show. Next, I want to start bringing in some of those rich JavaScript and, capabilities and components. Now, if you've been using web forms for a long time, I know a lot of folks have avoided JavaScript. It's something that you don't need to do because you can take advantage of processing on the server. But really, here in 2016, you need to start considering using more JavaScript tools, bringing these things into your toolbox, expanding your toolbox so that you can add great new features that really your visitors kind of expect in today's web. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to start adding in Bower. Now, Bower is another package manager that's available out there for JavaScript, CSS, and font and other static components that will bring features down from an endpoint out there at bower.io. This is a website that our friends at Twitter put together, and they've since donated as an open source project. And you can start to use these features with your web projects, and Visual Studio has great tooling for Bower built in. So I can add Bower capabilities into my project by starting off and saying add new item, and I can choose from this dialog, I can choose to add my Bower configuration file. And it's always going to be named bower.json. Now I've already got a Bower JSON file in my project, so creatively it's naming it bower1.json. I'm not going to go through and add that. I'm going to show you what I've already created. So here I've got the basic Bower JSON file the way it was delivered to me by ASP.NET. It gives this name, and then it marks my project as private. And then I can start adding dependencies. I can start referencing those Bower packages that I want to include in my project. So in this case, I want to start adding the Bootstrap responsive framework. And I want to add Angular, the JavaScript framework, so that I can build and compose my application. So by adding these capabilities inside this text file, you know, that's kind of the way that a lot of the JavaScript folks like to manage their applications. That's one way you can do it. And we have IntelliSense in here that you can use, and you can start getting some help looking up and resolving versions of things here, right? So we will see, there it is, there's my versions of jQuery that I can choose to add if I'd like to add jQuery. Or we've built some tooling in to Visual Studio as well, so I can right-click, come in here and say Manage Bower Packages, and I get a cool user interface that I can use to choose and manage those packages that I want in my project. Let me say one more thing about Bower, and then I see we have a question or two out here. Those Bower components, after they're downloaded, by default, they're placed in a Bower Components folder, and you can see here's the packages that I've chosen to add to my project. Now, there's a jQuery folder here. Even though I haven't added jQuery, I started typing that in, but I didn't really commit and say add this to my project, because jQuery is a dependent project of the Bootstrap package. Bootstrap needs jQuery in order to make things responsive, so when I added Bootstrap, jQuery came along for the ride. All right, let me go to a question here. I have a question from Greg. I thought we were navigating away from global ASAX. Why does it exist within the web form samples versus other ASP.NET Core projects? Well, Greg, global ASAX it's been around for a long time, and when we're talking about ASP.NET Web Forms, it still uses global ASAX to kickstart things and to launch my application. This is my application. It's my system web HTTP application instance, and where I can configure those events for my application to start and handle, and any other things that I want to put into the way my application runs. So I do need global ASAX when I talk about web forms and the desktop frameworks. So I understand your question, I understand your concern, and yeah, there's some things that are different here in the older versions of ASP.NET versus ASP.NET Core. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. We are still on global ASAX. So I am keeping an eye on the questions out here. I know that I've got some friends in the back room there that are monitoring and listening to questions for you. If you have any questions, please go to Channel 9, submit them, and I'll be happy to answer your questions about web forms and the new JavaScript frameworks and how you can modernize these things with Visual Studio 2015. All right, so I talked a little bit about Bower, and the question I get when I talk about Bower with web forms is, well, why can't I use script bundles or style bundles? Why should I move away from that technique? I really like using that. Well, when you use script bundles and you use style bundles, they're a great feature. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely think you should use them if they make you comfortable, if they make you happy. But when you do use them, if you have a lot of content that you throw into those bundles and you maintain and you've got a lot going on there, when you start your application, it spends a lot of time pulling all these components together, minifying them, and concatenating them so that it delivers one experience. And that's a lot of time that you could be spending responding to requests from your web server instead of putting together these static JavaScript or CSS files. Well, why not do that up front? Let's pull these things together up front while I'm writing my application, and they're not going to change because I wrote my application. I'm not writing things back into those JavaScript files while things are running on my production server. I've got a question here from Vinay. What's the significance of marking the project private in bower.json? What does that do? Good question, Vinay. Let me come back over to bower.json, and he's referring to this, line 3 here, marking things as private. Now, with bower.json, when you write things into this configuration file, this is actually defining your project, the files around this, as another Bower package. But we're not actually going to publish this as a package. By marking this as private, it's going to prevent the Bower repository from accepting this if we accidentally try to publish this as a package. Good question, Vinay. Thanks for sharing. Next question I have here is from Ahmed Dabdi. I hope I pronounced that right. I'm apologizing right now. I am so sorry. Why ASP.NET is more preferred than web forms in today's web applications? That's a good question. So I'm going to say that MVC is preferred because there's a nice separation of concerns. You have your model, your view, and your controller, right? MVC. We all know this. It's preferred because you're forced into this model where I need to put my data objects into that model. I need to put my formatting into that view. And I need to have my controller out there to pull those pieces together. You're forced to fall into this pit of success. It also makes it easier to unit test these things. If I've got interactions with the database that I want to test, I can work with my model directly and hook up a unit test framework like MSTest, XUnit, or NUnit, and test those things in an easy way. It's easier to get away from the web server because they're building just classes. I don't have these ASPX files out there that I need to compile and interpret because I might have things that are sitting in there that need to be compiled and interact with each other before I know if my page actually works, right? And typically when you're in MVC, you don't really unit test your views. Razor is a little bit tricky to unit test. It's possible, but it's not as easy to unit test as the controllers. So those are the big things that people look at when they talk about MVC and why MVC. And don't get me wrong, some of the things that, like what I showed here, where I had a SQL statement buried in an ASPX file, I've seen people do that in their Razor files also. It's possible to be a bad citizen over there and start mixing and matching metaphors. So you can be just as creatively destructive in MVC as you can be in web forms. So, all right, let me get back to the demo here. I talked about Bower a little bit. Now that I've brought down Bootstrap, let me add it into my project. Let me add it into my grid, and I'm going to do that here in my 4th sample. So in my master page now, I can add a link to my Bootstrap framework by just going down into my Bower components, Bootstrap, and then navigating this whole hierarchy. and include that style sheet. And I'm going to move that CSS that I wrote out to a style CSS file so that, once again, it's somewhere else and I can reference that. And when it changes, I'm not modifying my ASPX files. I'm going to put my scripts down here at the bottom. This is typically regarded as a good practice to put your JavaScript at the end of the page, because you really don't want your JavaScript running until after the HTML has rendered on your browsers that are visiting your site. So there's jQuery and then Bootstrap. jQuery goes first because Bootstrap depends on jQuery. So we need to list it first so Bootstrap finds it when it loads. So the next thing that I wanted to do with my grid here is I want to start to enable that table so that it works with the Bootstrap framework. So I'm going to add a CSS class for the table and table striped classes. This way we can get the responsive capabilities of Bootstrap on this table itself, on this grid, when it comes out in the browser. An important but not really highlighted feature here, we need to put use accessible header equals true so that I get table header indicators inside of my output HTML so that Bootstrap can take advantage and show those as a header to my browsers. And once again, I've got the same things set up here that I had before. Auto-generate columns is false. I turned off sorting here just for this. But I've got my fields, and then that capability that I had down at the end here, where I had my item, this time I'm going to stick the word days at the end of it, and I want to use some string interpolation here with the $sign. This is a new feature in C#6, and you can see Visual Studio is cluing me in here that the interpolated strings feature is a feature that's not available in C#5, the version that I'm using, and it wants me to use version 6 or greater. So this is where we're going to start to bring in something that I see Radu is already hinting at here in the questions. And I'm going to come back to you in just a second, Radu. Stay right there. We need to bring in a feature for the Roslyn compiler to be added to my project. Now, this comes by default when you start a new web forms application, but I'm going to add it into this existing application from NuGet, our .NET package manager. So I do that by right-clicking on my project, and I'm going to choose Manage NuGet Packages. I can also do this from the Package Manager console. Now, I have a local package source, and I'm going to go and grab my Microsoft CodeDOM Providers.NET compiler platform. This is available on NuGet.org as well. So I can click the Install button, and this will make Roslyn available for my ASPX pages, and all those features of C#6 will be available for me to use inside ASPX. And if you have a big project with lots of user controls and a lot of code going on in the ASPX pages, it should compile and be made available faster to your visitors. So now that I've added that in, if I build my application, I'll get a second here while it builds, build successful, and then this red line is going to disappear in just a second. So while I'm waiting for that, Radu, why should you use this mixture of dependency management frameworks, Bower, Gulp, NuGet, or other things? This adds overhead to your apps. Does it add overhead? It adds a little bit more development time, but Bower and Gulp give you, I'll talk about Gulp in a second, but Bower gives you a way to get those static references available there in your application from where the folks that are building those JavaScript libraries or CSS frameworks, from where they're actually delivering them. Bower isn't like NuGet, where we host a binary out there in the cloud on NuGet.org. Bower actually hosts a pointer to a Git repository, and when there's a new commitment to that Git repository, there's a new commit, and that's been tagged, that's available for me to download immediately. So this is one of the reasons that you see folks say use Angular from Bower or NPM instead of from NuGet, because we actually had a team here at Microsoft that was going and parsing out all that stuff that was updated whenever there was a new version of Angular or Bootstrap, putting it together and uploading it to NuGet.org. It's a little bit of an experience when someone sends you an email at 2:30 in the morning and they say, hey, Bootstrap just released a new version 10 minutes ago, why isn't it on NuGet.org? Well, by using Bower, it's available to you immediately. So here's a question from Tony. What is the future of web forms on .NET Core? Web Forms is not making the transition to .NET Core. It's going to stay with the full .NET framework that's available to you on Windows, and you're going to be able to continue developing with it. It's been in a great place here for the last 15 years, and we're going to continue to enhance it. We've got new features that we're talking about. There's a place on user voice. If you go to aspnet.uservoice.com, you can see what types of features we're discussing out there. There's even folks out there discussing whether or not we should add F# support to ASP.NET Web Forms. And I'd like to hear your feedback about other features that you may want to see as a Web Forms developer inside the framework. So check it out at aspnetuservoice.com. Let's see, are there any situations in which you would recommend Web Forms over MVC for new application development? I think, and that's from Sheldon Burks. Sheldon, that's a great question. Web Forms, I'll take the Pepsi challenge against MVC any day of the week. Web Forms is more productive out of the gate for that small application where you just need something that runs and you don't need a lot of scale, but you need, in my case, I needed a little list of trips that I could share with my wife, that I could share with someone to, see what's going on and be able to reference at some point in the future. It was a little grid that I created and pointed at a database, and no problem. But then when things start to grow and change, that's when we want to start looking at some of these techniques that I'm sharing with you to bring in JavaScript frameworks and to bring in responsive frameworks so that it works better on our phones, and it also will expand and grow and take on new features that feel better inside the modern browsers. Good questions, thank you. All right, let me move on. So I've added these accessible headers. I have these capabilities here. My red squiggly went away because Roslyn is now available. So let me come back in here. This is demo 4. So I will go to my /4 page, and it should look and feel the same, but slightly different because now we're using the Bootstrap framework, and now I've got great responsiveness inside my application. Things grow and shrink appropriately, and my duration is now formatted with the days extension. Now, okay, I could have done some things and made that just another piece of text hanging out there, but I wanted to show you string interpolation there. So that's how we can add Bower in, and now I've got my Bootstrap framework out there, and when Bootstrap updates, I can update from Bower very easily, and since I don't reference any versions inside of my where's my master page? Where'd that master page go? Since I don't reference any version numbers here in my references to the CSS and JavaScript, my pages should just continue working, assuming there isn't a breaking change from the Bootstrap crowd. So that's just a couple ways that you can get started with those. Now, this is nice, and I'm going to start writing more CSS and more capabilities with JavaScript, but this is really a pain in the neck to Alt-Tab back and forth between Visual Studio and my browser. It'd be great, it'd be really great if I could come through and see how my web browser was updated as I make changes to my CSS, right? So I've got my header 2 here that right now is my travel agenda. Well, it'd be great if I saw immediately, if I knew that when I said, when I changed the color, that I knew that it automatically impacted my page and I could see how it was affected, right? Or, if I changed my font family, right, and maybe I want to choose Times New Roman. How's that look? And I can see it immediately. This is a feature that we introduced called Browser Link. And Browser Link gives you this two-way connection from the browser to Visual Studio so that you can see these updates and be a more productive web developer as you make changes inside of Visual Studio. You see them in all attached browsers. Now, that's nice, and I don't like that font family, but maybe you're like me, and when I'm working with my designer on a web page, they'll want me to open up my developer tools panel down here, and they'll want to start looking at and tinkering with some of the changes down here. So, if we inspected that header again, let me grab this just because it's an easy place for me to show this off. And they'll ask me, you know what, can we make that font size a little bit larger, right? So if we say font larger, no, we need to make that font dash size, right? And that's not what I wanted to do, you know. Let's make it, I don't know, 32 pixels, right? That's, or you know what, 40, yeah, 40 looks good. So if I go through and I make a bunch of these changes, well, gosh, now I need to go back and get them into my CSS, and I need to remember exactly what changed, and it's a little bit tricky to go back and forth. Well, there's a feature here in Browser Link that I can bring up when I press Control, and you get this little bar that appears. And I can actually say Save F12 Changes, and it will push my changes back into my CSS files. So let me do that again. It didn't pop up quite right there for me, so let me tag this. And that was font size 42 pixels. Good. And save the change, and there it is. It pushed my change back over there. And then I can continue working over here, right? Because they like, they want this to be red. Wrong button. And I save that change. And it's not going for me just yet. Actually, it didn't even pick up the color. But you can see that you can work back and forth with this, and when you're not in a rush like I am, you can go back and forth and very quickly update your CSS files. Before I get to my next demo, I have a question here from Greg. Are these sample files going to be made available somewhere? Yes, they are, Greg. I don't like to show demos without actually making the code available to you. At the end of the session, I will have a link to my GitHub repository where you can download all of these, and we'll also put the link in the description on the Channel 9 video. Aiden has a question here. Why won't web forms be moving to .NET Core if it still has an application in the marketplace? That's a good question, Aiden. The things that we saw when we look at web forms is a really big framework that we actually tried to move to .NET Core initially. It was one of the things that we wanted to make happen, and it's so big, it's so complicated. There's a lot of layers here that have been added on after 15 years. And you know what? It works great inside the desktop framework for Windows. So let's leave it there. We can maintain it. And if folks want to continue using it, you can. So that's what we decided. Michael asks, web forms controls can render whatever HTML the programmer wants. Why hasn't Microsoft created a set of controls that emit MVC-ish code? MVC-ish. Let me parse that apart a little bit. Michael, it sounds like you're talking about something more like HTML helpers that you can use in MVC in order to have that same control-like experience, right? You can say HTML dot input for or HTML dot table, and you can start to build out markup that way. And a number of the control vendors have built similar extensions, HTML helpers, that you can use inside of MVC. Now, does it make sense to use those types of helpers and extensions inside of web forms? You can certainly do that. But controls have a pretty rich tool set that you can use here. So people prefer that. Basantu has a question here. Can I sync the style changes from servers where my code is deployed? Browser Link only works with Visual Studio. You can't run Browser Link outside of Visual Studio. So this way you don't have something hanging out there in your production area that's listening and trying to push things back to other requests and environments. So we don't deploy that when you publish your application. So thanks for that question. I didn't make that clear initially, and I hope that clears it up for you. So I've started to add some features into these pages here. And let me go back to that fourth demo. And when I'm looking at this and I bring up that console and I start to look at my network interactions, let's reload so we can see, right? I've got a bunch of things coming in here. Let me force that refresh. And I start to get some blocking things happen here. It's a little bit squished, but I get some blocking and I need to wait for some things to come down before others come down. and this is an HTTP request, it'd be great if I could take advantage of HTTP 2 so then I can multiplex and get all of these requests delivered at once. And then I can force SSL on my users so that I'm sure that all their interactions are secure. Now, enabling SSL for your development is something that we've had available in Visual Studio for some time. But I want to show you how to do it, and then I want to show you how you can turn on HTTP 2 on your developer workstation. Now, it's actually a lot easier than it sounds. If I look at my web project, I have an SSL enabled capability here. Just flip it to true. And now you'll end up with this URL that IIS is listening to with SSL extensions, right, transport layer security, so that all of my traffic is encrypted. And because the way that ASP.NET 4.6 is delivered, when it lights up on IIS 10, that's the version that comes with Windows 10 and with Windows Server 2016, you'll get HTTP 2 protocol enabled if we're serving SSL and the browser is capable of handling it. So let me grab this URL, let me restart my project, and I'm going to go right back to that same tab, and instead of going to 35270, I'm going to go to 44344. Yes, yes, I know it's not secure. Add an exception, yes. Good. And there it is, and everything loads at once, and you can see when I look at my requests here, these are coming in with HTTP 2. And there it is, version HTTP 2. So now I've got a secure multiplex delivery from my application. So now when you do have lots of JavaScript, lots of CSS, it may be beneficial for you to concatenate those together as one file, or it may make sense for you to use HTTP 2 to multiplex and deliver all of that content at the same time as it's requested. So that's a pretty neat feature that you need to be aware of when you start working with the newer versions of IIS. So let me move on to the next demo where I'm actually going to start to bring in Angular. Right? Angular is a good framework that a lot of folks really want to get involved with and get started with. And I'm going to start inside my application using Angular 1. That's the current released version. You know what, we'll close that one too. Now, you already saw that in my Bower JSON, I have Angular referenced here. I'm referencing Angular 1.5.5. Now, that brings it down and makes it available inside of my Bower components under Angular. And I'm just going to grab my Angular minified JavaScript and bring that into my web forms project. Now, this is kind of sacrilege to some folks that you're going to bring Angular into web forms, right? That's like putting a jetpack on a three-wheeled Yugo, right? My gosh, how you really want to do that? Yeah, we will. This is how you can get your existing application to use these new frameworks. I add a reference to that script down here at the bottom, Angular min.js, from my Bower components folder. I don't need to change anything else with my CSS because Angular is primarily a JavaScript framework. There are some folks that have built on some user interface components as well. And inside of my default page, where I had a grid before, well, now I'm going to turn that into a table because Angular doesn't know what an ASP.NET grid control is. It does know what an HTML table is. So now I'm taking control of my application. I'm taking more control over my angle brackets, right? There's a lot of responsibility of these angle brackets that you need to take control over when you start to use the JavaScript frameworks. So I'm going to wrap my grid inside of a div with a controller specified, and then I'm going to start to specify the same CSS classes that I had before that I was using on the grid view control. And I'm going to wire up some Angular click events on my headers. I've also got a repeat tag, so I'm going to repeat the trips that I fetch, and I'm going to format them like this with a medium date format, right? This is a filter here that says use the medium date format for this date object here. Using these double curly braces, right? We call this a mustache. This says, Angular, evaluate this object and put the contents right here. Now, the JavaScript that I wrote for this is hidden down here at the bottom. I've defined a controller, and I've got a scope that says I have an order by field, I have order by ascending, whether we want to sort our columns ascending or descending. And then here's where I want you to see that you can jump off from your existing web forms structure. I'm going to use the page methods from my JavaScript script manager, right? Now remember, we've been able to do this for a while with ASP.NET Ajax. I can take that method, my grid get data method, and in this case, I labeled it as a web method. This exposes it as a web method to my script manager, and then I can query it from within my page. So I've got the exact same logic in here. I needed to mark this as static because the page may not be instantiated when I'm requesting this. So I'm going to request that data, and it's going to come back to me. And inside my Angular code, come on now, there we go. I'm going to get that data, and the result that comes back, I'm going to wire it up to my scope as the trips object, and then I'm going to apply those changes. So I'm doing almost the exact same thing you might do with an XML HTTP request, but I'm doing it using page methods, so I take advantage of those same capabilities that I've already built in web forms. I have a question here. Is there any grid control in MVC like grid view, which is in web forms? There is a grid that you can use. There's an HTML table that you can use, but a real, good grid control that's out there. A number of the control vendors have built grids that you can use. I suggest you check that out. But there might be an open source one out there or two that you can get your hands on. And Blake asks, is there any built-in support for Web API or any web services that make it easy to bind the service responses to a web forms control? For example, a data grid being bound to a service method that returns a list of trip objects. Great question, Blake. This isn't something that we support out of the box with the ASP.NET controls. However, the control vendors have built this type of feature into their controls that they've made available for ASP.NET. A lot of them have free trials. I suggest you check it out. There's some really neat capabilities in there that allow you to browse and wire up and even use that as another data source with a great helper control so you can make that an easy experience. So let me wrap up here with Angular real quick because I've got about 10 minutes left. I see Daniel Roth is going to be coming on in just a little bit. Speaking of Web API, he's going to tell us a little bit about Web API in ASP.NET Core. So let me show you how Angular reacted here with my page method, because that's just a little weird, isn't it? So I'll bring this up, and here's my 6th page, and it loaded. You saw the little refresh there, right? It refreshed. It took a second to come back because it's making that extra round trip to go get the data and present it on the screen. And I can sort, and this is all happening browser side. I'm not making another request to the server. So Angular working with web forms and a web forms page to present content. Pretty cool and an easy way for you to migrate and start using Angular capabilities in your application. But the next question I get is, well, Jeff, I don't really like those page methods out there. I'd really like to get that out so I can really have my ASPX page focus on things like maybe security or other logic on what to present on the page that gets served and then Angular acts on. I'd really like to move those data methods somewhere else where I can reuse it for other clients, maybe a mobile application. And that's when we want to start to add in Web API. Now, in my 7th and final demo I want to show you here, I actually created a trip controller that knows how to reach into my same repository and call that same get method when I get an HTTP GET action called on this controller. So by convention, I'll navigate to the /API/trip endpoint with a get HTTP action, and I'll receive my trip objects. So my default page here, I didn't add any other Angular capabilities, CSS, any other JavaScript. I just changed my segment right here that was going and getting that data from my page methods. So I'm using the HTTP object inside of Angular to query the API trip endpoint. When it's successful, wire up my trips object. Not bad. Real easy to do. And when I go to my 7th demo, after a second here, we'll see I get the exact same thing. So I'm hitting Web API now to bring that back instead of my ASPX page. So a bunch of different options there. And the final thing that I want to show you, I mean, this is nice that I can see how it sizes appropriately here, but what if I want to see how this looks on a phone, right? I've always got my wife saying, well, how's this look on my iPhone? There is a tool that you can download from our friends at Electric Plum that will add into Visual Studio 2015 to simulate the iPhone. So if I come through and I say browse with iPhone simulator, it's going to take a second here and start up this simulator from Electric Plum, and I'll see something that looks like an iPhone. Come on, where is it? It doesn't want to start for me. Let's close this. I'm running the trial version here because I just did a fresh install. So you get a trial for 15 days when you download their package. Let me grab this, and I'm going to go to that last demo, and you can see that it looks and feels right on a phone. So there you go. We've taken a very simple grid, we've made it look and feel good on a phone, and it does sort properly for me. It looks like I've got another question here from John Galloway, I think is how you say his name. Any advice on using .NET Core libraries with my web forms app? Now, that's kind of crossing the streams here, right? There are ways to do that. You can compile your .NET Core application so that it has desktop support, and then you should be able to reference it from your web forms application. And there are ways to set up your web forms application so that it's not listening on certain folders, and then start up your ASP.NET Core application so that it's in IIS and only listening on a certain folder within the same application. So it's listening on the same port, but if it comes down on this set of folders, it'll go down into this application. But if it comes down to my /core folder, let's say, it'll go into the ASP.NET Core folder. There's a way to do that, and I'm working on a blog post that shows you how to make that work, and we'll have more details about that in the future on the ASP.NET weblog. Let me go back to the slides here to wrap up, because we are right at the end. So there was a question earlier about where can I get the source code for this? I put it out on my GitHub. If you go to github.com/C#Fritz, go to Modernize Web Forms, and you'll see all the demo code that I showed you here today. Check out the web dev blog, the ASP.NET web dev blog at blogsmsdn.com/webdev. We have great articles that we're putting up there about web forms, about ASP.NET Core, and we're going to talk about how you can use these together. There's going to be a lot of great content coming there over the next few months as we see these exciting changes in ASP.NET. Email me if you have any questions about web forms that you want to see happen, new features. Drop me a line. I am jefritz@microsoft.com. And on Twitter, I look forward to your tweets. I read every single one of them, and I'll respond to as many as I can. I am C#Fritz. I think that's all for me here today. Thanks so much for watching. And if you're watching the recording, let me know who wins the Stanley Cup. I want to place a bet here on Pittsburgh.